Hey there, intelligent automation community. Welcome to February finally. And, Addie, since you were so good at our video last week, why don't you tell everybody what we're going to talk about this week?
Clouds.
Exactly. Good job. Okay, go back to mommy. All right, you guys are stuck with me this time. So, Blue Prism recently announced new options on Azure and the AWS marketplaces, but these were really different offerings. I was having a little trouble understanding the difference between these and also explaining it to colleagues, and so I went back through a couple years of press releases from Blue Prism, Automation Anywhere, and UiPath to draw some comparisons. And basically what I found is all three vendors have a fairly consistent theme, which is they're terrible at explaining exactly what they're launching, in particular around AI and cloud solutions. And I have a suspicion that's because most of the press releases around those two topics are really targeting investors and industry analysts and not really meant to explain what's being launched to end customers. So my goal today is to demystify some of the vendor buzzword bingo that goes on in those press releases and help to explain how, or your various different options for using RPA with cloud providers. It's a fairly lengthy topic, so I've actually split this into two different videos. In part one, which you're watching right now, I'll specifically cover the three scenarios where you deploy RPA on your cloud platform of choice. So you already have an RPA technology, or you're thinking about rolling one out, you selected that, and your company happens to use AWS, Azure, Google Cloud Platform, what have you. What are your options for deploying that? In part two, I'm going to cover the scenarios where the platform is set up and managed completely for you, either by the RPA vendor or a robotics as a service company. That video is going to be a little bit more technical and probably a bit more colorful than the video today. Okay, so that probably didn't help to keep your interest in this video, but let's start with all the major cloud providers offer some range of cognitive and machine learning solutions which they host. These are services like Amazon Textract, Azure Form Recognizer, Google's natural language processing capabilities. In Blue Prism, you can connect to these cognitive services by downloading pre-built drag and drop skills from the Blue Prism Digital Exchange. But realistically, all the major RPA vendors have an approach to enable more intelligent software robots by hooking to these cloud-based cognitive services. So let's put the cloud cognitive solutions off to the side and specifically focus on RPA in the cloud from an architecture perspective. Okay, so you've selected an RPA technology and your company across the board has a primary cloud platform that you use for a lot of your technologies. Of course, as option number one for deploying RPA in that cloud provider, you can take a standard infrastructure as a service approach. You can stand up your own deployment in your provider and control everything. You work with your internal cloud, networking, and security teams. You provision the necessary infrastructure on your cloud provider, and you start from a blank slate. The three major RPA vendors, and I'm counting UiPath, Automation Anywhere, and Blue Prism in that category. I know there's a lot of additional vendors and some really strong ones in this space, but for this video and the next one, we'll count those three. All three of those have standard reference architecture for deployments within Azure, Google Cloud Platform, Oracle Cloud, Amazon Web Services, and the IBM Cloud. This obviously gives you the most control over your configuration and environmental controls, similar to an on-premise deployment, except you don't need the actual local infrastructure. About 60% of the companies that I work with have already deployed RPA in this infrastructure as a service, control everything type of model. They've either set all of that infrastructure up completely in the cloud provider, or some of them have a hybrid deployment where part of the infrastructure is in a cloud provider, part is on-premise, and that adds extra elasticity as they need to turn things off and on. I also work with US defense manufacturers that are using Blue Prism in the Azure government cloud, so if you're in that space, just be aware that's an option that you can do as well. So this first approach requires the RPA vendor and, more importantly, the customer to have a really strong understanding about how that cloud provider operates in their target systems. But the cloud provider doesn't really have any direct investment in the success of this option either. Really, aside from the RPA vendor writing documentation and reference architecture, nearly all responsibility in this particular setup is pushed over to the customer, or maybe the partners and delivery partners that a customer is working with. Moving up the maturity curve, where the cloud provider is actually involved with the success of your program, you move into a bring your own license model. And those have become a bit more prevalent over the last year or so. In fact, Google Cloud Platform is the only provider that does not have a BYOL, bring your own license model, with any RPA platform as of today. But realistically, that could change any day. In the bring your own license model approach, the cloud provider and the RPA vendor have established what architecture should look like between their two technologies. You can then have the cloud provider spin up hosted infrastructure that has been pre-configured for that RPA technology, and as the name suggests, you can activate the pre-installed RPA software by simply loading a license key that you've purchased somewhere else. Bring your own license. The big key here is that the customer is starting from infrastructure with some level of design already in place. They're not just starting from scratch. The third and final option for this video could easily be called a transact model. This works a lot like a bring your own license model in that the cloud infrastructure can be provisioned and pre-configured, preloaded with a specific RPA technology, but the cloud provider and the RPA vendor have a commercial agreement in place where you can actually buy the RPA software through that cloud provider directly. The transact approach typically caters to new customers or smaller businesses and helps by working that RPA software cost into your existing subscription payments with that cloud provider. So with all three of these options, you can offload the data center aspects of RPA to a cloud provider, but you're still going to manage most aspects of the platform and the platform health. If you want to take the bigger leap and offload all the platform management, tune back in for part 2, which is going to be a bit more technical, as I mentioned, probably a bit more colorful because I'll get specifically into competitive solutions. I'll try and get that uploaded this weekend. Until then, have a great week and maybe pray that February is a little less weird than the first month of 2021. Stay tuned. See you next time. Thanks.